And to see how this has been fulfilled, that is, they have not listened, you should read some of the curses. Many of them have never been translated into English, so many people don't know they exist, but they still are valid curses in the literature of the Roman Catholic Church. Curses pronounced upon the Jews. And if you could read Latin, you'd be astonished at the things that are stated in these curses. Official pronouncements of the Roman Catholic Church. So this is a warning to the Gentiles that they not fall into spiritual pride because God is dealing with them now. They should remember that He's doing this with a view to the fulfillment of His program. Now the figure of the olive tree then is designed to be a kind of illustration by which Paul will admonish the Gentiles. Now we don't have time in the time that we have to support all of the minor points that I want to make. I want to simply state in general what this olive tree represents. I think I can prove it if we had time. But most of you probably will accept what I say because I think that you recognize that this is probably the teaching too. The olive tree in this passage is designed to represent the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant in its origin with the fathers, in its development, and in its fulfillment at the end of the times of the Gentiles. So the figure or illustration of the olive tree and the branches is designed to represent the Abrahamic covenant. Now we have already spent a great deal of time on the Abrahamic covenant. The important thing to remember is that that covenant was an unconditional covenant in which God Himself took it upon Himself to make certain inviolable promises which He guarantees on the basis of His faithfulness to His word to perform. Remember when we were discussing the Abrahamic covenant, we went back to Genesis chapter 15 and we spent a great deal of time on that ceremony by which God inaugurated the Abrahamic covenant, demonstrating so clearly that it was a unilateral covenant in which God Himself was guaranteeing the fulfillment of His promises. Remember when Abram parted the animals and the flaming furnace passed between the pieces. Remember, it was the custom in making such a covenant for both parties to the covenant to pass between the pieces because each ordinarily had obligations when they made a covenant. But in this Abrahamic covenant, God Himself, in the form in which He appeared to Abraham, passed between the pieces, and Abram was not invited to follow. Because God was making certain promises which He would fulfill, and they did not depend ultimately upon Abram. That's grace. That's grace. That's why you're saved. Because God has in eternity past, out of His own good pleasure, determined that some people, and He has discriminated. Discrimination may be a bad word today on the earth, but it's a beautiful word in spiritual things. He has discriminated and determined that you, if you're a believer, should belong to Jesus Christ. Now that determination does not rest upon the fact that He has foreseen that you would believe, for it doesn't rest on you. It does not rest upon any holiness or good works which you may have or perform. It rests upon the good pleasure of His will. So you don't like that. I love it. I love it. Because if it rests upon the good pleasure of His will, then I've got it, and I cannot lose it. Well, that's what God was saying to Abram when He passed between the pieces, and Abram was not invited to follow. He was saying, Abram, I'm going to fulfill those promises, and they don't really ultimately depend upon you. Your activities may delay the fulfillment, but the completion of the covenant is certain. Now that's the background of the illustration. This is the Abrahamic covenant in its origin with the fathers, its development, and its fulfillment at the end of the times of the Gentiles. It's a parable from horticulture. Now most of you who are not experts in horticulture like I am will not understand this very well. In fact, some of the commentators who often fulfill that scripture, all we like sheep have gone astray, do not understand this. They occasionally accuse Paul of not knowing much about horticulture. Because one of the first lessons you learn about horticulture is that if you want to do some grafting, you do not graft a wild slip or sown into a cultivated stock. That's the reverse. You take a cultivated sown or slip and you graft it into wild stock. Now, the reason I know that is not because I'm so intelligent. It's because I saw my father doing it in Charleston, South Carolina, years ago. He grew camellias, and he occasionally would take a clipping off of a camellia bush, a cultivated sown, and graft it into wild stock. That's the way most of the camellia bushes are grown. Wild stock, cultivated sown. Now, Paul is going to talk about the grafting of wild branches into the stock. That's contrary to nature. But Paul knew a little bit about horticulture. In fact, I think he probably knew more than some of his critics, because he states in verse 24, if thou wert cut out of the olive tree which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree. So he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was talking about. Well, now then, I'm going to read very quickly through these verses again and just make a few comments again so that you'll catch the force now of what we've been talking about. This is the Abrahamic covenant. The branches, of course, are Israel. The root is Abraham and the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises were made to Abraham, confirmed to Isaac, confirmed to Jacob. Now then, in verse 17, or verse 16, if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. In other words, the promises made to Abraham communicate their relationship to the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you Gentiles, a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, now notice that. It says that the Gentiles are grafted in among them. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that they are the recipients of the Abrahamic promises. That's why we are called the children of Abraham. Now, we're never in the New Testament called the children of Israel. Israel is always Israel. Judah's always Judah. Those national relationships are always true. God has Israel as an election, and he has the church as an election. But we are children of Abraham because we do participate in those promises. We are grafted in among them. Notice it. And with them partakest of the fruit and fatness of the olive tree. Boast not against the branches, but if you boast, you don't bear the root, but the root bears you. In other words, your blessings come from Abraham. You will say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. You have a very tenuous relationship. The promises were not made to you. They were made to Israel. And in his grace, he has grafted you in among them. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed that he also spare not thee. Behold therefore the goodness and the severity of God. On them who fell, Israel severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also shall be cut off. And they too, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. He says it's possible. It's within God's power to bring Israel back into the possession as a nation of the Abrahamic promises. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature in a good olive tree, in other words, if he's done the strange thing and the difficult thing, how much more shall these, who are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? The original text, there's a great deal of stress upon that. It's their own olive tree. It's not your olive tree. It's their olive tree. In other words, it's more to be expected that God would restore the Jews than it is that he would save Gentiles. And he's already saved Gentiles. Now imagine you're about as confused as the old verger who said, St. Mary's Anglican Church, in Oxford where the Bampton lectures are held. He said, I've been in this here church